Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
A few weeks ago, I went out to dinner with my wife and another couple. No big deal. Happens all the time. Actually, we were scheduled to go, got canceled. We had to reschedule for whatever reason. But these things happen all the time. I assume they do because I went out to this restaurant and there were other people I knew who were sitting with other couples. So it's nothing earth-shattering about that. But when we got into a conversation, there was a point where I'm like, okay, I am talking too much. I feel like I'm talking too much. And we might all, maybe it's just me, I don't know. But it was one of those things where it's like, okay, yeah, they're listening and they're nodding their heads, and these are the questions that they've asked, and I'm going into detail, just trying to give some context, some meaning to it, and but in hindsight, or just even there, I kind of felt like I'm talking too much. I'm just talking too much. And it was interesting because shortly thereafter, I got an email from certainly not from them saying you're talking too much. They were too polite. Just coincidentally, got an email, a newsletter from somebody, and in there was a link to an article, Harvard Business Review, How to Know If You Talk Too Much by Mark Goulston. So it's actually a June 3rd, 2015 article, but it's one of those articles that's timeless. And so I opened it up, and very interesting article. It certainly gave me some insight on things that I could be doing better. Was I talking too much? Probably. I think it certainly depends on the audience, but probably I could have been a little more concise in what I was saying. But it is what it is, and it certainly gave me something to think about. But let me share a little bit about the article, because I think there's some interesting. Anything Harvard Business Review is, peer vetted, meaning other people have, bought off on it and said, yeah, okay, this is just not merely conjecture. But what it talks about in the article is that there are really three stages to a conversation. The first stage, when you're talking, is that you're on task, you're relevant, and you're concise. And then you sort of discover that you roll into the second stage, and I guess this really kind of illustrates where I was that evening. You kind of roll into the second stage where I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good talking. I'm going through detail, really laying out what I wanted to say, and it had to do with some personal stuff. And then you get to that point where you feel good talking, you don't even notice that they've stopped listening. And then the third stage is you kind of lose track of what you're saying, and you realize that you need to reel the other person back in because they're not listening. All of a sudden you sense they're not listening, and then you need to reel them back in. And what do you do to reel them back in? You talk more. And that kind of describes the conversation and why I came away saying, geez, I really talked too much. And I didn't say anything to my wife about it because, she's kind of a quiet one. She just as soon I'd talk. So she's like, hey, you talk. I don't need to. I can't imagine a situation where she would be like, geez, you didn't give me a chance to say anything. She's just how she is. She'll talk my ear off, but when we're out in another setting, she won't necessarily be the one talking. but in the article it kind of talked about what's going on, and that's the key, right? What's happening here? Why do people talk too much? I'm a big proponent. If you've listened to this this podcast, I should say, if you've listened to this podcast, I'm a big proponent of getting the other person talking. And I do get a question from time to time, get the question from time to time. What if they're just asking you questions and trying to get you talking? Which is a great question. If you run into two people who are really both very good at trying to listen, it almost feels like a stalemate. And there are situations where you can listen more, and there are situations where you will talk more, and then there are situations where there's a balance. And clearly there wasn't a balance with respect to me. At least I don't think so. Nothing's been said to me, but upon reflection, I'm just like, yeah, I talk too much. But what's going on here? The first reason why people talk too much, why I might have talked too much, and it says in here is that human beings have a hunger to be listened to. And that's very true. We want people to be interested in our lives. We want to feel like we have interesting lives, whatever they might be. Even when I was a tax accountant, boy, this is interesting. I discovered this and that you can do this. And to me, it was totally fascinating. The people I worked with, it was fascinating. And other people who were accountant types, it was fascinating. Maybe not everybody, but in those circles, it was fascinating stuff. And you wanted the people to listen to, hey, my life had value. Those 8 hours or 10 hours or however long I was working had value, and let me share with you what that value was. But the second reason they say that people talk a lot, it's because the process of talking about ourselves releases dopamine. Dopamine, it's kind of a pleasure hormone. And that's one of the reasons why people who talk a lot become addicted to talking. It brings pleasure to them. And, I can see that. But it's interesting in this article. Again, it came out in June of 2015. Mark Goulston, he works with a coach, and his coach said to him, and they'd been coaching with each other for a while. His coach said, Mark, for an expert on listening. Well, let me back up. Mark Goulston wrote a book called Just Listening, or excuse me, Just Listen. And so he's done a lot of work in this particular area. Just to kind of give you some background on Mark Goulston, he is a medical doctor. He's a business psychiatrist, executive advisor, keynote speaker, and CEO and founder of the Goulston Group. And he's the author of Just Listen and the co-author of Real Influence, Persuade Without Pushing and Gaining Without Giving In. So he wrote this book in 2015 called Just Listen. I think he's an expert on listening. And his coach said to him, Mark, for an expert on listening, you need to talk less and listen more. That made me feel a whole lot better because, yes, I really feel like I was talking too much when I was out to dinner with this other couple and my wife. And I realized that, I'm not necessarily a bad person, but I did have a bad episode. I did have a situation where I talked too much. And there are times where I catch myself maybe listening too much. I just let it go, and I have things to say and I don't jump in, but clearly in that situation I needed to listen more. And I think we're all guilty of this. But what he goes on to talk about in the article, he talks about his coach, Marty Nemko, Nemko, and he's a host of a radio show about work on KLAW, which is NPR's affiliate in San Francisco. But Marty Nemko, or maybe it's Nemko, but at any rate, his coach has a guideline for talking and whether you talk too much, and he calls it the traffic light rule. And relatively simple. But in the first 20 seconds of talking, your light is green. Your listener is liking you as long as the statement's relevant to the conversation and somewhat in service of the other person. Uh, I think that's maybe should go without saying, but I will say it. I mean, if I'm talking about taxes, if somebody who doesn't care anything about taxes, 20 seconds can be an eternity. Um, but if I'm talking about taxes, somebody who's an accountant or somebody who runs in those circles, yeah, it's relevant. They're going to lean into that, and that's the green light area, that first 20 seconds. Um, but unless you're really gifted, people who talk for more than a half a minute at a time become perceived as boring and too chatty. So after that 20 seconds, the light turns from green to yellow. And yellow's not stop, but it's certainly a warning sign, right? The first 20 seconds, I'm sharing something of value, something of interest, maybe something entertaining, and I'm okay, but 20 seconds, okay, it goes to yellow. And if you're familiar with Toastmasters has a system much like this. They actually have a lighting system, and most talks in Toastmasters are 6 minutes, and you go. I believe, if memory serves me, it's been 10 years since I've been, or probably 15 years since I've been in Toastmasters. I spent a couple years in Toastmasters, but your first 4 minutes you're in the green, and then when you get to a point, the light turns yellow. I think it's at 4 minutes or 5 minutes. But when it's in yellow, okay, I'm in that zone now where I need to be starting to wrap up. And if you get to red, well, you're in big trouble. You've gone over. And so, according to this traffic light rule that Marty Nemko has, the host of talk radio program with KALW in San Francisco. 20 seconds you're in green, and then it goes from green to yellow, and that gives you another 20 seconds. And during that 20 seconds, you certainly increase the likelihood that somebody's not listening and that you are talking too long. But at the 40-second mark, well, your light's red and you need to find a way to shut it down. How do you shut it down? That can vary. It would depend upon the situation. Maybe you fire a question back at them, or do you understand what I'm saying? Might be a question. Or does this situation ever affect you? I know in the conversation I had with this other couple, we were talking about our parents and aging parents and dealing with aging parents, and at one point being somewhat conscious that, okay, I'm going on, hey, are you having any sort of these issues with your parents? But to ask a question and then kind of turn it back to them and see what they have to say. And if they have questions about what you're talking about, then it's kind of another green light to continue, if you will. But what they talk about in the article is that you really need to assess your underlying motivation for talking so much. Is it just that you just makes you feel good, and you're trying to get stuff off your chest? Or are you just really trying to clarify your thinking? That certainly can be it. You're really trying to lay things out. Some things are difficult to be concise about when you're giving some context as to something that you're saying. And sometimes it might be the situation where you're listening all the time, and all of a sudden you have an opening that somebody's listening to you, and by golly, you're going to take it. And so you can end up talking a little too much. One reason that people are long-winded is because, and I notice this when I get on calls and that, is that people are trying to be impressive with their conversational counterpart, trying to show how smart they are. And that can certainly be an indication that maybe they don't think they're very smart, or there's some sort of insecurity there. I certainly see that as happening. The other reason why I think people can talk too much is and it alludes to this in the article, is they just can't keep track of time. 20 seconds, try and figure that in your head. That's not easy. I mean, the difference between 20 seconds and 3 minutes is easy, but the difference between 20 seconds and 40 seconds, it's a little more difficult to keep track of. How I like to think about it, and how I really want to kind of approach this going forward, and when I get into these sorts of situations, as if they're like short little sprints, right? You just have a short little sprint, you say something, and then you ask them, hey, how about you? Why don't you contribute? I don't say that, but you do something to try and pull them in, give them some input on the situation. And then that gives you, if there's an opening, then you continue. And just kind of go back and forth and back and forth. In reality, that's a conversation, right? It's not a monologue. And sometimes we get into situations where people will give us a monologue. And it does get old. It does get old having to sit through that. I find that I get cut off from time to time. And as I've alluded in earlier podcast episodes, while it somewhat annoys me, I understand that I'm somewhat to blame, because I have these pauses, searching for the right word. And people might think, well, I'm done. No, I'm not done. I'm just looking for the right word. And that can be easy to do, especially less so in Zoom times when you can see somebody, but certainly in situations where you can't see somebody, and then there's that pause, on the phone, namely on the phone. Anyhow, talking too much. How do you know if you're talking too much? 20 seconds, you're in the green. Get beyond 20 seconds, you're in the yellow. When you get to about 40 seconds, okay, you're in the red. You better figure out a way to shut it down, or you're probably talking too much.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today, and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.